Mark 6:31b. This was the scripture basis for the retreat center that I had out in the Flint Hills. That's what the logo is on the front part of the bulletin, Tallgrass Spiritual Retreat Center, where women find their way. My dear friend Hazel came up with that byline, I guess you'd call it. And it was where women found their way because I was a single woman out on the prairie by herself, and the board decided it was better for me just to have as a women's ministry than to have men coming and going. So that's why it's where women find their way. I want to tell you a few of the stories from Tallgrass Spiritual Retreat Center where women came away by themselves to a quiet place. First, let me tell you about Joan. Joan was a freelance writer. She came from Missouri to interview me for a magazine, or so she thought. She thought that's what she was coming for. These kinds of writers usually expect and include what they call a media package containing basic information about the places that they visit. She expected me to hand her something that told the history of Tallgrass, how many women we'd worked with, and that kind of information. But I said, sure, come on out and we'll talk. She came to do a full interview with me. She began her interview, and it quickly turned to personal issues in her own life. And I listened. I listened with my ears and with my heart. I call that my third ear. I never know for sure what I'm going to hear or what I'm going to say from what I hear. I often have ideas pop into my head. As I listened to her, I suggested that she had traveled so much that perhaps she needed to do a Native American tradition that we had done at the retreat center, calling your spirit back. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of that before. I did it once, and it was very, very meaningful. I have a friend that's a therapist, and she said, Billie, I think that anybody that works with the public, a therapist, a doctor, a pastor, even a clerk in a grocery store, people that meet people a lot, need to call their spirit back every day. And it's just a matter of saying, God, I left my spirit with so many people today, pieces of me with this person or that person or in this place, and I'm just calling my spirit back to be whole again. And Joan tried that, and she had an incredible experience of healing in this quiet place where she came by herself. And then I'll tell you about Katie, who was 73. I was about 50 at the time, and for me, thinking about a 73-year-old driving from Colorado all the way to Matfield Green seemed like a long ways. I think I could still do it today. But Katie drove her VW camping van out to the retreat center. I had never seen a van quite like this before. It just looked like a regular VW van from the outside. But inside, there were beds, there was a place to shower, a place to wash dishes. I think that she had a camping stove she had to take outside. But it was all inclusive, and she would take some of her friends out in the mountains and go on retreats. But she came to Chase County, to Matfield Green, because when she was a young woman, she was a teacher, she came to Chase County by herself and had a very, very difficult experience in Chase County. So in 73, she came back to the retreat center to be able to let go of those memories and that experience as a young woman in her 20s. And again, she had an incredible experience out there by herself. She came by herself and had this experience with God. I had a woman come out to the retreat center who had been raped by her pastor, the youth pastor, when she was 16. She was in a church where when the word came out, she had to stand in front of the congregation and apologize to the pastor for what she had done. And then she was later assaulted about 10 years later by a date that she had. And she came out to the retreat center to find healing. And we did EFT, Emotional Freedom Technique, the tapping that I think Sue has shown you. She came out several times, and she did find some healing from that. For me, I found some healing one time when I had a group of people come out, men and women, to the retreat center. It was the collective boards from Kansas East and Kansas West Discipleship. And I put the women in the bunkhouse because I wanted them to experience the bunkhouse in hopes that they'd come back, bringing others for a retreat. So that meant I put the men in the main house, which was my home. And I had stayed over with the women until later after supper. And when I went back into my house, there were all these men, I think there were 9 of them, just sprawled all over my living room. And they were talking about things like second half of life, about what is it when the kids all go away from home, empty nest syndrome, things that I could relate to. And it was so healing for me to hear these men talk about these experiences. There was a woman who hit the door talking, talk. She was the only one registered for a day retreat. It was on a Wednesday. I could tell quickly as I listened to her that what we had planned for the day was really not what she needed. So I asked her permission to shift gears early on, and she said yes, and she was able to do what she needed to do when she came away to this quiet place for healing. There was an older woman who came with a group, and they walked the labyrinth. We had a grass labyrinth. Different than the labyrinth here, ours was just simply mowed into the grass. And she walked the labyrinth, and I watched her, and I could tell something was going on. So when she got through, I went over and asked her, thinking she might want to talk. And she did. She said that she had a lot of memories of her husband who had passed within the year. And walking the labyrinth had brought back a lot of memories, and she just needed to talk about it. And there were many other labyrinth stories from out at the retreat center. There was a man, after he got through, he said, it was like I walked through all the decades of my life. He was in his 60s, and he said, when I started out, I was just a little toddler. In the next circuit, I was like a grade school kid, and then a teenager, and then in my 20s and my 30s, and he just experienced his whole life on that labyrinth. I had another woman who walked the labyrinth, and when she got to the center, she just walked off of it. She didn't walk out of it. And she said she did that because she felt like she had no center, no focus to her life at all. And walking the labyrinth brought that up for her. And today she is a certified labyrinth retreat facilitator. And it was because of that walk. She had started a feeding ministry in Illinois, and it was a nonprofit, and she had just given away the reins as the head person of the ministry. And so that's why she was feeling like, I don't know what to do. She said, I don't have a business card anymore. And she wouldn't have realized those things if she hadn't come away to a quiet place, I think. There's a group of women from Russell, Kansas, that would come out to the retreat center about twice a year. On their very first trip out, their organizer, Luann, said she just wanted to fill up the van to come from Russell to Matfield Green. She wanted to give some quiet time for the worker bees of the church. As I said, they came usually twice a year for several years. Luann said they came as friends and they left as sisters. Most of them don't live in Russell anymore, and yet they're still very, very close, and I watch them on Facebook myself. I found many of the facilitators that the retreat center used among the women who came out. There were women who never thought about being a retreat facilitator. I just saw something in them when they were out away on their own, that there was just some spark, some passion in them. I have a friend, Hazel, who did a retreat on journaling. She called it Owning the Right to Write, R-I-G-H-T, to W-R-I-T-E, Owning the Right to Write. Kathy came, and she'd read a book on finding passion in your life, and I invited her to lead a retreat on the book that she had read. And the group of women that came out, they still talk about it, and this was probably 12 or 13 years ago. they discovered on the weekend that there's a big P passion and there's little P passions. The big P passion is something that drives us, but oftentimes we don't even know what it is. But there's little P passions in our lives that that get us involved in life in ways that we're not even aware how fully passionate we are about things. Barbara from Cheney was a Native American. She came out to do a forgiveness ceremony, a Native American forgiveness ceremony. We did that 2 years in a row. It was very meaningful to the women that came out for that. We went down to the creek and one at a time would kneel at the water and it was early, like late March or early April. We take the water and splash it on our faces. It was cold, but it was sort of like an awakening or a reawakening, and asking forgiveness for ourselves and also for those around us. And this was we were told this was a tribal event that happened for the whole community. They would go down to the river, and this was after the winter had happened, and people maybe got kind of crotchety with one another over winter, so they do this ceremony in order to forgive one another. Mary Jo was a therapist in El Dorado who came out to do a retreat on dream work. She had found healing in her own life through the power of dreams. Jane Koger, I'll say her last name because she's the ranch owner, she and I did the dance of the prairie chickens for, I'm going to guess, about 10 years. People came from all over the country to watch the prairie chickens dance. We had one couple from Kansas City that were used to photographing large animals, and they fell in love with the prairie chickens. We had people from Texas, Oklahoma, California, Illinois, Michigan, New York, all over would come to watch the prairie chickens. There was something about being out on the prairie, on a hill, at 5:30 in the morning, in the dark, waiting for the prairie chickens to fly in, and hearing them before we could see them. There's just something about being out in nature at that time of the day that was very meaningful to people. Marva did a wildflower retreat. There was a woman that came from Georgia. She'd been on wildflower walks all over the world, and she came twice to do the wildflowers at Mattville Green. Jill from Great Bend, who's now in Topeka, did a stargazing retreat, and we had people come from all around Kansas for a stargazing retreat. We went, I'm thinking that I had somebody from Prairie, Kathy Larson. I think she came out when we did it in the winter, and her daughter from Topeka, would that be correct? Okay, we were waiting for her. It was freezing cold, and we thought, how are we going to go out and look at the, it was actually my birthday, it was December 13th. How are we going to look at the stars when it's so cold? And there was almost like a blizzard in Topeka, but yet Kathy's daughter came, and when she showed up, we went outside to greet her, and there was just like a warm breeze that came through, and we got to be outside for about 20 minutes and look at the stars. We did it also in the springtime. Jill had brought her telescope. Anybody that had a telescope was invited to bring it. My oldest now, only granddaughter at the time, Allison, came, and her other grandparents were from Protection. But standing out on a hill in the middle of a pasture in Mattville Green and looking up at the Milky Way was just an awesome experience. Chuck from Waukene brought horses. He does something called Hooves of Heaven, and he talks about how horses respond to people and help us understand ourselves better from their response. And I was scared of the horses, so I stayed outside of the pen and watched. And that was okay. That felt safest for me. But for some of the women, it was really powerful. They were, at one point, we had 5 women there, I think. They were told to get the horse to move from one position to another, from one location to another, without talking, and just watching the women, how they performed, what they did to help these horses move. One woman recognized that she always stayed on the outside of the circle, and watched until she felt safe enough to step into the circle. Chuck took his horses to church on Sunday. We had announced that we were going to have horses. There were normally about this many people in church. That Sunday we had 40 people. We had a little pen set up outside of the church, and people got to experience some of what the women did on Saturday before with the horses. And we had Jeff come from Topeka, and we did paper making with prairie grasses. And I just came across my paper this last week, and it was just such a joy to see what we created from something that came out of the earth. So these are some of the things that had happened at the retreat center. It seemed like almost everyone that came out there had some kind of a meaningful experience. I think being in nature, I think being out away from what they normally do. We did not have internet in the bunkhouse. Some women didn't like that, and the telephone service was not 100%. Just getting away from the norm made a difference. Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. I think that every problem we have is a question trying to ask itself. Every problem contains a quality trying to emerge. Every problem is a gift trying to be given. I believe this, I try to live this out, and I taught this to the women who came to Tallgrass. I believe we carry our own answers within us. Sometimes we're too busy to listen, either for the question or for the answer. I'd like for us to imagine right now what life might be like if we considered every problem a gift wanting to give itself to you. I don't know what kind of issues, concerns, problems you might have in your life right now, but think about them being a gift wanting to give itself to you. What if problems were no longer something to struggle through or just accept, but to unwrap and find the beauty within them? I know that this sounds crazy to some people. It might sound crazy to a cancer patient or to someone who's been or is being abused. As a survivor, I've learned the truth of this. There is beauty in the questions, in the struggles. Now, I'm not quite sure how this fits, but it seemed important to include this. I learned that all attack is a call for help. When we know this, we begin at once to look deeply into the question of what kind of help is being called for. And I'm thinking if somebody attacks us, somebody yells at us, somebody says something that's not true about us, they call us on something that wasn't ours to be called on, this is an opportunity for us to discover what kind of help is needed for that person. I can't remember if I shared in this congregation, and you know I like to tell stories over and over again. I had conflict with our former bishop, former bishop now, and I was in his office even, and he showed a very different persona in his office than he did out in public, and it was wounding. And not that night, but the next night, I sat down with an exercise I had called the church to do on the Sunday before, and that was to sit and imagine I was breathing to the heart of the other person. First, I do some slow breathing myself, and then imagine breathing to that other person's heart, and then just let whatever happens, happens. And what happened for me was I saw the bishop as a little boy who was very wounded. And I still believe that he was a wounded little boy. That was my question. How could he treat me like that? Because he was a wounded little boy who'd never really resolved his issues. When I thought about all attack as a call for help, I first thought this meant that if I was attacked by someone else, that attack was a call for help from the other person, and I do believe that. Attacks are not really personal. They come from the pain and the emptiness of another person. As I was pondering this statement, I realized how personal this statement is too. Any attack I make on others is also a call for help. And since I'm the only one that can make any changes in my life, I need to learn how to recognize that when I attack someone else, I'm calling out for help and to ask for help rather than it being an attack. If I can think that, it's so much healthier. I also realize that sometimes I attack myself. We all attack ourselves with mean thoughts, mean words, and it's still a cry for help when we do that to ourselves as well. Needing to listen to what we say to ourselves is important. So the scripture again is, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." Mark 6:31b. I invite you to think about how in this new year, in 2023, you can find time to come away by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. It could be rest from the busyness of life. It could be rest from concerns and issues, rest from thoughts that you have. But we all need that rest. We all need to find quiet places. Sometimes it can be in our own homes. Sometimes we need to get away from the normalcy of home to be in a different place. And it could be, when I was a pastor at Derby, at Madison Avenue United Methodist Church in Derby, I would take a monthly retreat day, and I'd go different places. One time I put up an 8-foot table in the basement, and I put a sheet over it, and I crawled underneath it like I used to as a kid. Took my Bible, my journal, and a soda pop. I was drinking soda pop then, and I just crawled under the table, and that was my quiet place for the day. One time I went down to the park. One time I sat in the mall in Wichita, and I took my journal, and I just watched people. And I saw people of color. I saw people speaking different languages. I saw people holding hands. I saw little babies. I saw a lot of stuff I didn't see in Derby, and it was renewing, rejuvenating for me. So it doesn't necessarily, it can be all kinds of places that we go. And just be intentional about looking at life differently. So that's my message, my offer, my challenge for today. And I'll close it with Amen. Amen.